Good evening. It's an honor to be here, and I want to thank everyone at the University of St. Mary and sponsors for tonight's event, Center for Peace and Justice, the History Department, the University, and of course, Country Club Bank of Leavenworth. It's wonderful to be with you virtually, since that's all that's possible in the midst of a pandemic and actually an ice storm here in the middle of West Virginia, which is why we thought we would pre-record some of this in case we lost connectivity at some point of our evening. But I do look forward to your questions at the end of this, and I look forward to speaking with you a little bit about some Kansas history as well as the history of the Civil War and its memory. So our theme for tonight is to talk a little bit about the history and memory of the Civil War as it's reflected in our monumental landscape. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the background behind some monuments that have been in the news and offer historical context. Also, I want to talk a little bit about how historians are using a variety of tools, including digital tools, to offer context for history around you, obviously including monuments that are controversial, whether they've been removed or not. We can offer context. There's usually important history that needs to be remembered, even for monuments that are deeply troubling. We don't want to forget that we created these monuments and why. But I also want to talk a lot about the effort to commemorate the monumental landscape, to offer context for all of the things around us. All of the places and spaces have a history. Every town in America has places that have a history, and that history is interesting because the people who lived there and created them were interesting. So we are using digital tools, this website and app I created originally with my students to interpret Appalachian history that's grown nationally, called Clio, in honor of the ancient muse of history. Clio's grown to over 35,000 individual articles, and you can use it to discover the history behind theaters, behind buildings. There's walking tours, and it's oftentimes a great, fun thing to use. At the same time, we don't shirk away from the contested and complex and oftentimes difficult histories that also surround us. So I thought I would start the evening off by talking a little bit about this particular monument that's been in the news lately here in 2020, 2021. It was created, it was dedicated in 1876, but the movement to create the monument actually started a little bit about a decade before that by Henry Highland Garnett following Lincoln's assassination. He and other black leaders collected funds and was able to raise $20,000. They worked with the designer Harriet Hosmer. She was one of the preeminent designers of monuments of the era. And they designed this elaborate monument that's here on my right. Looks far different from the monument that you see reflecting what was actually created. And this image is from Kirk Savage's book, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves. He dedicates all of Chapter 4 to this history of this monument. So you can see in this monument Lincoln in the middle with other political leaders of the era, but on the outside you see 4 statues of Africans and African Americans. Those 4 statues depicted freedom in Africa, enslavement in America, and then freedom in America once again through black military service. So it was important to Garnett and other black leaders that this statue not simply commemorate Abraham Lincoln, but offer Abraham Lincoln in context of African American history and agency. And like I said, enslaved people and former black troops raised $20,000, which was enough for a respectable memorial, but not quite this massive monument that they hoped to create, which at the time would have been the largest monument in Washington, D.C. And so the effort stalls, and there are different people involved. And in the 1870s, a group that was working to create a memorial to Lincoln in Washington, D.C., learned about this effort, and they may not have gotten all of the information. The design was lost. We don't know that they had the worst of intentions behind this, but they end up appropriating the effort and the money to create this bronze image of Abraham Lincoln with Archer Alexander at his kneeling before the former president as his chains are broken. At the dedication speech for this monument, there were 25,000 people, and they heard a speech by Frederick Douglass. Now, Douglass and Lincoln had tremendous respect for one another, and Douglass's speech is full of praise for Lincoln. Some of that is really contrasted with his predecessor, James Buchanan, and his successor, Andrew Johnson. But he does have praise for Lincoln, and at the same time, he wants the audience to know that this image, and perhaps the image of many whites of Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, does not reflect his perspective or the perspective of African Americans who freed themselves during the Civil War. "It must be admitted," Douglass exclaimed, "truth compels me to admit. Even here in the presence of this monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president and entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master. The race to which we belong were not the special object of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my fellow white citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme. First, midst, and last, you and yours were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstance and necessity. To you it belongs to sound his praise, to preserve and perpetuate his memory, to multiply his statues, and to hang pictures high upon your walls and commend his example. For to you he was a great and glorious friend and benefactor." This critical view of Lincoln can be seen in our own time. Lerone Bennett, Ebony Magazine, wrote multiple articles offering this critical view of Lincoln as the great emancipator. There's articles by Eric Foner and many others about Abraham Lincoln and his limitations. To his credit, I don't believe that Abraham Lincoln would have liked the image on the left very much. I think he would have much more liked to have been part of the memorial that Henry Highland Garnett and others hoped to create. At no point did Abraham Lincoln refer to himself as the great emancipator. In fact, he was always pretty forthright about his intentions and limitations, and a lot of what Douglass had to say, Lincoln had said himself in various forms, sometimes quite bluntly. But monuments are exercises in selective memory. And sometimes when you start with a thesis, an answer instead of a question, you're able to go out and sort of cherry pick sources to support your preconceived idea. And this monument here on the left is a good example of this. It was dedicated in 1931 by the Faithful Slave Memorial Committee of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They started with a thesis that enslaved people were better off, were loyal to their masters, and did not wish for slavery to end. And they went out and cherry-picked sources, and they tried to create memorials honoring enslaved people who fought against those who fought against slavery. And so John Brown was a particular target of this. And so when they discovered that the first person killed during John Brown's raid was a free black man who was killed by the raiders, Hayward Shepherd, they decided to create a memorial to him. Although we really don't know much about Hayward Shepherd, and we certainly cannot determine his motives or determine that he opposed John Brown. In fact, what we do know about Hayward Shepherd's life would suggest quite the opposite. But that didn't matter to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They had their thesis, and they wanted to enshrine it into stone. So that monument was dedicated in 1931. The very next year, W.E.B. Du Bois offered quite a lot of criticism and context to put that into perspective. This plaque on the right was added, I think, a couple decades ago by the Park Service. Now, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, another group that tries to vindicate the antebellum South and its institutions, opposed the creation of this plaque, giving the perspective of W.E.B. Du Bois. And from their perspective, they said, we don't put these sort of interpretive plaques offering a contrarian view of a monument next to the Washington Monument or next to the Vietnam Wall. Why would we do it here? Of course, there's a critical difference in that this monument was intentionally created to support this narrative that is utterly false, that enslaved people opposed their own freedom. Why does this matter? Well, the United Daughters of the Confederacy were not just very effective at creating memorials and monuments, but they also dedicated a lot of their time to trying to dominate the way history was taught in schools. And they were very effective at this. If you read the 1948 textbook, A History of Virginia for Boys and Girls, it has this to say: "It is a great tribute to the honor of the Negro race that he," meaning John Brown, "was unable to carry out his plot, for only a few Negroes joined him." And again, this is sort of cherry picking. We know that there were maybe 11 African Americans supported directly the plot, or were absolutely there, beside John Brown. But to say that African Americans didn't support what John Brown was trying to do is not something that the sources can possibly support. Now, monuments aren't just contested territory. They're complex and they're interesting. And so one of the things I asked myself about 7 or 8 years ago is what we could do to offer context behind all of the incredible historic sites. And starting about 7 or 8 years ago with my students, we created this site called Clio. Clio is the ancient muse of history. We named it in honor of her, and it interpreted Appalachian history. And of course, it's grown since then to cover the entire United States. And at some point, there have already been efforts, I think, on 4 continents to use it. At some point, I do hope it's able to help people understand the history all around them. It's fun to use when you travel, of course. Like everything, there needs to be a hook. So we named it in honor of Clio, and this statue behind me is actually Clio, dedicated in the early 1900s in North Carolina, and then melted down in 1942 because it was bronze and copper, and that copper was really useful for the war effort. We can offer the interpretation of monuments like this monument to Clio that's been removed, as well as the story behind historic theaters, as you see a young woman exploring around her to discover the Frederick Hotel and the Keith Albee Theater. And we can embed audio, and there are over 1,100 walking tours now. I'll get to that in a little bit more detail. The website, if you want to check out, is theclio.com. Clio.com is legal software, and they were there first, so they get that URL. Monuments need context. And oftentimes, because of the people who were creating the monuments, in the North, it was largely the Grand Army of the Republic, and in the South and in Appalachia, it was largely the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so there, even though East Tennessee and East Kentucky and West Virginia and other parts of the border South stayed loyal to the United States, there are still far more monuments to the Confederacy because the UDC and SCV were absolutely dedicated and very effective in doing that. This Ken Burns documentary that came out in the 90s was very effective in getting a lot of people to learn more about the Civil War as sort of a gateway drug. It got people excited and interested. But the program itself was problematic. And so there's a publication featuring C. Van Woodward and Eric Foner and Catherine Clinton and other great historians. Ken Burns, The Civil War Historians Respond. And Catherine Clinton points out that there was really a wholesale neglect of women, in her own words, Foner, Woodward, and others point out that about half of the audio is given to Shelby Foote, a pro-Confederate biographer. He was quite an interesting character on film. Definitely helps, I think, the production value of it, but he certainly started with his own thesis, and that was problematic to Foner and others. And they point out that the original intent was for it to be the Civil War and Reconstruction, but when Shelby Foote started talking about Reconstruction, what was coming out of his mouth was deeply disturbing. It mirrored the recently, maybe 1950s and 1960s, Shelby Foote's interpretation still held sway among historians, but Foote echoed the Dunning School interpretation of Reconstruction as a tragic era of mismanagement because African Americans were voting and holding office. And as soon as Ken Burns is hearing this 19th and early 20th century white supremacist view of history coming from Shelby Foote, who he'd already filmed all of the Civil War parts, he decides, oh, that's it, and he just shuts the project down, and that's why they don't actually get into Reconstruction very much in that. And that's a real problem, because you need to get into Reconstruction to understand the Civil War and its context. You also need to really understand the Civil War as a civil war. If you travel around the world and you go to Latin America and you say, I'd like to see your monuments to the Civil War, they're going to look at you a little cross-eyed, and of course they don't have those. America's really one of the only places where you see a monumental landscape dedicated to the side that loses the Civil War. And there's a reason for that. The Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of Confederacy were effective for decades in buying land and raising money and dedicating monuments. And if you're a political leader and you oppose them, you probably would find yourself out of office before too long. But in response, we oftentimes forget about the Southern Unionists or the Appalachian Unionists. We forget about about 200,000 African Americans from the South who serve in the Civil War as well. And we forget the tragedy of the Civil War. Sometimes we like monuments precisely because of the parts they leave out, like the dying and the wounded and the prisoners and the deserters and the widows and the grieving mothers. And sometimes we can forget how many homes and livelihoods were destroyed in the process of the war. So this monument behind me was dedicated in 2009 in Harrisonville, Missouri, to the Burnt District. 3 counties in Missouri that homes were burnt to the ground in retaliation for general order, in retaliation for the attack on Lawrence as part of General Order Number 11. And I submit to you that this monument showing a chimney, because all that was left were chimneys, and all you could see in the landscape were chimneys where homes had once stood. This is an important part of memory of a Civil War. If you go into Arkansas, if you go into West Virginia, where I live presently, if you go into Pennsylvania, where Confederate leaders captured hundreds of free people of color and sold them into slavery to make money during the Civil War, and understand that until less than a year ago, the building where we trained teachers at my university was named in honor of a Confederate raider who sold 100, maybe 200 people into slavery. A Confederate raider. The building where we train our teachers in West Virginia was named in his honor. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy were behind that effort, and they were very effective in dominating our view of the Civil War. Now, one of the things that I really enjoy doing is traveling and finding monuments. And when I make it home to Kansas, where I'm from, when I make it back to the Flint Hills, where I grew up near Emporia, I hope to find this monument. I've only been able to find one photo of it. This is on a site called Hands on Heritage, an article by Robin Van Auken. It was the only place I was able to find this monument that Jack Davis dedicated in 2010. Jack was of partial African descent, and he had learned about the Exodusters and their history and the connection to his land and the generations before in this community called Dunlap that was about half black and half white. And when he found that he had a terminal diagnosis with cancer, he spent the last months of his life creating this monument to the exodusters, who were African-American pioneers to the West from the South. There's about 20,000 of them that arrive in Kansas between 1879 and 1880. And these pioneers are largely forgotten. And there are only a few historical markers, I think a street in Topeka named in their honor. The historical memory is really still dominated by this idea that the good white people of Kansas all banded together to help these folks when they showed up. And like any good myth, there are elements of truth to that, and that absolutely did happen for some of the migrants that were the first pioneers to show up. Governor St. John, the governor of Kansas, I've seen the letters, I've held the letters in my hand where he writes to some of these African-American pioneers who are looking and asking about their chances if they come to Kansas. And he writes back and shares this touching story of how when he was captured as a Civil War soldier and escaped, he was aided back to Union lines by African-Americans. And he says, I promise you'll get a fair shake here. Come to Kansas. And he gives ideas of prices of land. And these individuals, they spend a lot of time preparing for this migration, using whatever resources they have as sharecroppers. It's difficult to get any cash, but they pool their resources, and 20,000 of them come to Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, a little bit in Indiana and Illinois. And Kansas actually offers a perfect way to explore the Civil War. You've got two bookends. One is John Brown, and the next one is John Brown's son, who gets involved with this relief effort. But like so many others, his effort is really pretty minimal. And the story of the actual exodusters and their experiences still hasn't been told yet in the detail that we would expect for a group that is really some of the last pioneers to the West. When 20,000 African Americans leave the South, it alarms some of the Southern planters. And the Democratic Party, which at this point in time really represented the white planters of the South, they, through Daniel Voorhees, who was an Indiana Copperhead who opposed the Civil War, they have actually a huge congressional hearing to try to figure out why African Americans are wanting to leave the South in 1879 and 1880. Of course, it's easy to understand. They were sharecroppers. Their freedoms were certainly limited, but also their economic potential. And in Kansas, they saw a chance to own land. There were hundreds of witnesses and hundreds of pages. They didn't talk to very many African Americans. What ends up happening is the Republicans, who represent the Northerners, and at this point in time was a more progressive party on issues of race, they blame Southern Democrats, they blame planters, former enslavers, whereas the Southern Democrats say it was a plot by the Republican Party to bring black voters to the Midwest to try to dominate the elections. And of course, none of that's true. If you would have just talked to African Americans, it would have been pretty simple. They were pioneers and they were farmers. But this is, I think, a good example of the limits of our monumental landscape, where this monument that I hope to find and I hope to discover someday, I hope to go visit, close to where I grew up, I didn't know this history until graduate school. But what an opportunity. Monuments and markers do have potential to teach. And this monument taught a lot in the last few years as it was being debated, and eventually they decided to remove it. The history behind this particular monument in New Orleans is a white supremacist coup. Multiple white supremacist coups where white supremacists who didn't like the election results in Louisiana, because at this point it was the Republican Party that was the more progressive on issues of race, they armed themselves, they shoot and they kill police officers, and they physically take over the government in New Orleans. But what ends up happening in 1874 is the army comes. And that happens again in 1876. But in 1877, the Compromise of 1877, as it's called, which may or may not have happened, but the long and short of it is that the army has been removed from the South so that they aren't there. And so when the white supremacists arm themselves and take over the government, 10,000 strong, they succeed. So you see what happens when a coup attempt is allowed to fester year after year. These white supremacists kept growing in numbers. And as long as the federal government and the army came in and restored order and defended New Orleans from this attempt, they couldn't succeed. But because they were never arrested, they were able to continue this effort until eventually the politics of the nation had changed to where this coup was allowed to succeed. This doesn't just happen in New Orleans. It happens in Wilmington in 1898. It happens in a lot of other southern communities during Reconstruction. And if you look at the history of Hawaii, it's a similar story where a coup attempt was allowed to continue for years. Now, these monuments, in and of themselves, may or may not teach us very much. Usually if you see a soldier, it's a soldier just at parade rest, which isn't probably very representative of that soldier's experience in the Civil War or any other war. If you think about what a monument might look like for the Iraq War, they're usually very different from the Civil War monuments. I submit to you that this might be a good model of one, although the photo is me, and I don't think that it would be appropriate. But this was me in Iraq. You can see two children with me holding a bag of candy that I had given to them from our care package. This was pretty common. In fact, we always were carrying around candy at this point in time. If you read Civil War letters, it's monotony, it's boredness. It's really just asking how things are at home, eager to return home. And there's not much discussion of really anything else other than how much they want this war to be over and how much they want to get back home. So how do we get this idea of the Civil War as this glorious period? Why do we have Civil War reenactors? If you could go back in time and tell troops that in the modern era people will reenact the war, they would be quite confused by this and would probably wonder why anyone would want to march 15 miles, eat hardtack, and sleep on the ground. Of course, that's, or dig a ditch every day. But a lot of this is because of this myth of the Civil War as this glorious lost cause, where both sides are fighting for these abstract concepts of honor. So the United Daughters of Confederacy, Sons of Confederate Veterans, and other neo-Confederates have put forth this idea that is referred to as the lost cause, and actually sometimes they refer to it as the lost cause in the early 1900s. And the lost cause has three major tenets. One is that the Civil War was not about slavery. Another one, that enslaved people were loyal to their enslavers and treated well in most instances. And the third being that the Confederate generals and troops were superior, and they only lost because of the overwhelming size, industrial might, and population of the North. Now, the first two are pretty easy to debunk. Of course, it's important to note that historians were culpable in this. Historians started with a thesis, and number one and number two there supported their preconceived ideas. And in the early 1900s, historians wrote countless books, basically claiming number one, but especially number two. For example, they would start with a thesis, they would start with an answer, and then they would go out and sort of cherry pick sources. So they believed that slavery was not so bad, and they would find letters of formerly enslaved people to their former enslavers where the formerly enslaved seemed quite friendly. And the letter had fond memories of their time on the old plantation. And it really, because it supported the preconceived ideas of these particular historians, they went with it. Of course, if you actually go back to the original primary sources, you can, and if you don't start with a thesis, if you start with questions, you can find what was really behind this. And in most cases, the letters are kindly because the person is hoping for the enslaver to write back because they're asking for information about former family members. And so if you see a letter of someone saying, would you please give me information about where you sold my mother, where you sold my children, where you sold my wife, my husband, I want to be reunited with my daughter. Of course they're writing kind and nice things because they're trying to get a response, because they're trying to find what happened to their family. And so it doesn't take very much to see behind number 2 and number 1. Number 3 is a little more complicated, but military historians can easily debunk this idea that Northern victory was inevitable, or that the Confederate generals and troops were superior. Certainly some were, and there are certainly instances of valor. But the idea of this sort of being our entire history is sort of difficult to accept. So the UDC really grows out of this effort. It starts with the Ladies' Memorial Associations right after the war to bury and honor the dead. But by 1894, when the UDC is formed, it's a very different type of organization, and they are formed to vindicate the Confederacy and support this lost cause narrative. Now, in fairness, they do some charitable work too. They support veterans' homes, nursing programs for men whose bodies had been completely destroyed by the war, but most of their effort is trying to dominate and win the historical narrative. And they were incredibly effective in this regard. They rewrote textbooks, and they opposed monuments in the border South that would be either neutral or pro-Union. And they raised money and dedicated hundreds of monuments over the next series of decades. To give you an idea of what they were trying to do, this was the Catechism that children were required to memorize and recite. And you can kind of see an old one-room schoolhouse. How were the slaves treated? And they would have to respond in sort of this sing-song voice, with great kindness and care, a cruel master being rare. And this sort of indoctrination was very common, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy were incredibly effective at it. The first historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy wrote a book 3 years before her appointment to that office celebrating the Ku Klux Klan. And her book actually became used by the Mississippi Public Schools. The UDC president at that point in time praised the Klan, and Caroline Helen tried to push the artist who created Stone Mountain to not just include Confederate generals, but Klansmen, and to celebrate the Klansmen. She also tried to reinterpret some of the New York Peace Monument, which was dedicated around 1910 in Tennessee, depicted a Union and Confederate soldier shaking hands. And to have a monument like that in the South was just difficult for the UDC to accept. And so some of their leaders tried to get interpretive signs there that attacked black voting and black suffrage as a great evil, and did so in not so veiled language. And if you look at the dedication speeches for some of these monuments, for part of the time, it sounds like any other speech you might hear on Memorial Day. They talk about the valor of soldiers and serving their country. Of course, they're referring to the South at this point in time. But then there would oftentimes be these asides where they talked about the heir of Reconstruction being the heir of enfranchising African Americans. And black suffrage was oftentimes at the center of this. And so if you can imagine a dedication speech after dedication speech, where a lot of the time is not spent on the war or on veterans, but instead making a political argument that African Americans should be disfranchised. This is one of the main reasons why historians who get involved in this, when they find the dedication speeches, oftentimes it helps people to understand the context behind the monument, that this isn't simply a monument honoring soldiers, although in many cases it is that, but things can be more than one thing. And of course, when you look at the dedication speeches, you can see through it pretty quickly. There are more Confederate monuments in West Virginia than there are Union monuments. There's even a Confederate monument in Union, West Virginia, and it was dedicated explicitly to the defenders of the lost cause. A lot of that speech is sort of innocuous, but at one point the speaker talks about the evil of black suffrage. at the dedication of the Stonewall Jackson statue at the West Virginia State Capitol, which is still there, supporters wore buttons that said Lily White. Lily White was a reference to the early 1900s effort to reverse the enfranchisement of African Americans. And so it's easy to see that these aren't simply monuments honoring individuals. The monument behind me is the Peace Monument in Tennessee on Lookout Mountain. Mary Davidson Carter in 1932 proposed a revision to this. She was a UDC leader, and she wanted it to say Beast Butler and his Negro troops, and then talk about how these creatures actually being carved into stone, referring to African Americans who had won political office during Reconstruction. And so when you get to the backstory behind these monuments, and you can look at some of the monuments that have been removed recently, or oftentimes in the news, like Silent Sam on the University of North Carolina campus, that particular speaker had an aside where he bragged about physically assaulting a black woman. If you can imagine, in the middle of a dedication ceremony to a monument, that particular one was supposed to honor, and explicitly did honor, students at the University of North Carolina who fought and died in the Civil War representing the Confederacy. And yet the speaker felt compelled to brag about, in his own words, the quote is, horse whipping a Negro wench in the midst of that. So these are obviously some of the more heavy instances of our monumental landscape and how that monumental landscape has been shaped. There's always decisions, there's always stories behind it. Normally they're less difficult, although these stories, I hope you'll agree, are essential. And if we decide to remove the monuments as citizens, we all get a vote. If communities decide to remove the monuments, we need to remember, though, that they were dedicated. I wouldn't argue that we must keep the physical monuments. A lot of these are in parks and in public places, and I can imagine I don't have to imagine, I know the psychic strain because I've interviewed people, and I've interviewed African Americans about these monuments, and they talk about how these are in a park where they play with their children, they bring their children, and there's a monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest, an enslaver who attacked and killed and slaughtered African American troops during the Civil War. How difficult it is to have a monumental landscape that includes these sorts of things. No matter what societies, whatever communities decide, we hope they'll be informed by historians, and we also hope to continue to interpret the story behind the monuments and the markers in the places. So Confederate monuments are obviously a very small part of what we're doing with Clio, but it's certainly something that's important. Most of our stories are about historic theaters and buildings and walking tours where you can hear community members share memories of towns, and it's a powerful experience. It's definitely been wonderful for families. During the pandemic, they can plug the phone in your car and just drive around and hear the history behind places and see historic images. Since this February, I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing to commemorate African American history. We've got walking tours through Black communities where you can hear oral history. So you can hear people in their own words talking about the community and the Black businesses and the efforts and what it was like living here. We have a number of walking tours. This particular image is of a young woman using Clio to discover that she's standing at a site where there was a civil rights sit-in. And we actually digitized primary sources, including old newsreel footage. We digitized it so she's standing there actually watching the sit-in happening right in front of her, and she can listen to the voices of people that were there, from participants to we even found a woman who was 17 at the time and was working her first job as a waitress at that restaurant, and she was able to share some history that we didn't know about that particular place. There's no marker there, there's no monument, but you can use Clio and it's like you're there. And of course we have links to primary and secondary sources because we're historians, and we try to offer this sort of like fishing. The article starts off really slow, really small with one paragraph, builds up to a backstory section, usually about 6 paragraphs, images, and then of course links to related books and articles. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to commemorate the historical landmark. If you've ever tried to, if you can imagine trying to write the history of the Battle of Blair Mountain in 3 sentences, when you're carving into stone or metal, it's rather difficult, and oftentimes you have to use the passive sense in order to fit it all in. We're able to offer a lot more content for that, and it's been incredible to see how quickly it's growing. It's completely free thanks to donors. If you're interested in this, you can go on the website. It's theclio.com, and all donations are tax deductible. I use the funds to hire graduate students usually who create and edit the content. So a few other examples of this. My campus at Marshall University is best known for the tragedy that happened in 1970, where we lost 75 people in a plane crash. This memorial fountain in the middle of our campus was dedicated in their honor. We actually found, in addition to oral histories that we recorded, we found the dedication speech, digitized it, and put it there so you can actually hear the fountain being dedicated, and it's an incredibly powerful experience to stand there. You can actually hear the words sort of bouncing off the fountain as you stand there. The top right, that's where I went and got my driver's license renewed. It used to be a World War II factory staffed by Rosie the Riveters. One of my students found a Rosie who had lived there, a Rosie who had worked there, and she shared her memories of the place. So even when you're at the DMV, you can be connected to history. And then behind me is a bench dedicated in honor of Julian Bond. A student of mine was able to find a close friend who was a freedom rider, and then also Julian Bond's widow, Pam Horowitz, interview both of them so you can hear about Julian Bond and his life and legacy while you're sitting on his bench. And imagine that he's there with you. Some cool stuff that we've added tech-wise. We've made it so that you can use augmented reality to get directions. And so here is an example. So you can walk around downtown, and if you're taking a walking tour, you can be guided by this arrow that points you along the way. It's integrated with the compass, so you can't possibly go wrong. You can also pan your phone around, and you'll see images pop up for historic sites, sort of like Pokemon, but for history, right? So that's been a fun thing that we've been working on. And then here are our daughters using the augmented reality arrow to walk around a museum complex, and they can hear the blacksmith tell them about the history behind them, and they can hear the stories of some of these people talk about how they recreated the cabins behind them, and some of the fun stories behind there, as well as the history of the place they're at. So these are just a few different examples of how we've been using technology to connect people to history through Clio. Again, it's completely free, nonprofit, and it's been supported through donations. And through those donations, I've been able to offer some stipends, some modest stipends for graduate students around the country who have been helping creating this content to interpret places and spaces. Everything around us has a history, whether it's a monument with a difficult history, whether it's a monument we haven't created yet, historical markers, other landscapes. And it's been such a pleasure to see this project grow over time and offer some good. I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation. I hope it's maybe given some ideas about the potential of using technology to connect people to historic sites. Most of the entries, like I said, very few of them are very few of the 30. I think there's 38,000 entries now. There's probably about 400 or 500 for Confederate monuments. So the vast majorities are places that still exist, maybe less controversial history, but there's still an incredible and compelling story behind each of these places. And it's been our mission to share that with people. And I hope that will be something that you will value And I would really welcome a conversation with you about the potential of this and how we can interpret our monumental landscape using technology and connecting people to books and articles so that it's a fun way to explore history as families, but also a way to commemorate sites of conscience and difficult histories. Because everything around us has such an incredible story, and it's been a lot of fun to see some of the creative things that people have created with this. So again, thank you so much for watching this. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope that you will support our effort to interpret the places and spaces around us.